And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for this month's Stories from the Field. This month, we will be discussing Provider CARES Act funding, and I am going to turn that over to Wanda so she can get this show started.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a couple of little reminders as we get started. Please mute your line if you're not speaking. When asking a question or offering a comment for the panelist or presenter, please select all panelists in the chat box so we can all see your question. Your participation is valued. Please use the chat box for interactive discussion and select all participants, and so we can all hear. All right. So I'm Wanda Crocker. I'm your presenter for the day. I am the statewide lead for Provider Relations, and Provider Relations is heading up the COVID grant review process from the local level. So today we are going to talk about not only just in general the Provider CARES Act, but we want to share with you the actual process. There are multiple stages to the review process, and the local level is not the final step. So we want to share with you all of the levels or stages that the request goes through in review, and also some enhancements that we've made, go over the most recent issued guidance on timelines and how we're going to address that. And then we have some tips to share with you on things that you could do to prepare for your submission to help make things go smoother. And we'll look at some data selected as of 9 a.m. this morning regarding where we're at with submission of the COVID grant and the funds available. All right. So please forgive me. I'm going to go a little backwards from my normal process. I know a lot of people need to leave at 1:30. And these slides won't take very long, but I think it's worth just reminding people about the variety of resources that we have for COVID-19 to assist providers in their efforts. So don't forget that we are still here to assist with coordination of testing. We had sent information out several months ago about that, but recently we really slowed down, and 100% of providers did not accept the offer for us to assist with coordinated testing. So we want to let you guys know that that is still available to you, and that is the information there. Always also want to remind you that there is public link to community testing. In fact, new locations for November 1st through 7th were just distributed. So please don't forget that anyone who's a resident of Missouri can access the community testing at no cost. We also want to emphasize the guidance and resources around operational guidelines that every provider should be developing to strategize on how to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's all I'm going to say on those resources. I just want to remind everyone that they're out there, and please access them. And if you have any questions about what you see, please contact Provider Relations, and we'll get you to the right place. Okay? I forget, it's a little different than a regular screen. So there are actually 4 stages of the COVID grant review. The regional office or local level is only the first stage, and our function is to review all of the documentations you've submitted just to make sure that every line is filled out, it's signed, it's notarized, and essentially that the cost for the group home and ISL attestation and invoice passes a smells test, as Val likes to say. We track every step of that local review, and we save all of our documentation and communication to a central office shared drive so that we can go back and see where we got hung up or where it is in the process. So, so it's essential to know that that is just the initial review. And you might say, well, then why does it start there? It starts there because of the amount of details that are involved in this. And although on the surface these attestations seem like relatively simple, it's easy, so easy to miss a box, to miss a field. And then that's when we come in and we send it back and say, you're missing this, you're missing that, this is not dated. And because if it doesn't have those things, we cannot approve it. So when we are done at the local level, it goes to central office. And what they do is they check against SAM2. SAM2 is the payment source for the COVID grant. And provider relations at the local level does not have access to SAM2 to see the information available for the provider in that system. So after that point person reviews the information and makes sure that the SAM2 address, name is all equivalent in SAM2 versus the attestation, it goes to Angie Brenner for signature. That person keys in the authorization to the system, and then they send it to the department grant manager. And that grant manager provides that level of approval, and then it goes to stage 4 when the grant manager passes it to Office of Administration, who presses a button and says, yes, pay this itemization. So the grants manager level of approval usually is within, I would say, half a day of the central office submission to her. So it's very, very quick from the second to the third level to the fourth level. So at the beginning of this stage, the local team was notifying the submitter when the request moved from stage 1 to stage 2. So what we've done to enhance that is we're now going to be CCing the submitter and the administrator or CEO if that person is different from the submitter. Between stage 1 and 2, I should say CC, and we're forwarding, between stage 1 and stage 2, and between stage 2 and 3, and between stage 3 and 4. So we have a system where I am getting CC'd on the communication between stages 2 and 3 and 3 and 4, and then I'm feeding that back to the local level to forward that information to you. So we're hoping that that will help everyone understand exactly where their request is in the process, because I know that that gets really kind of antsy and frustrating when you're not really sure where your documentation is and whose hands are on it. So we hope now that we have this enhanced communication in place, which we have been doing since last Thursday, hoping that that will help clarify and keep everyone that needs to know in the organization aware of where it's at. So on October 20th, VAL issued a new memo about timelines for the CARES Act, and it is just essential that we all understand these timelines because there is no changing them at this moment. So all provider invoices and attestation submissions have to be received prior to November 15th. If you submit on the 15th, your submission is absolutely final. If there are issues with the attestations or the invoices, we are not returning them to you, and you may not get paid. So that's one of the big holdups on our review cycle is those empty blanks. Is that date missing? Is the name not correct? And we'll go over some of those tips later. But if you turn your invoice or your attestation in on November 15th and there is anything wrong with it, you will not get it back. It will be forwarded, and it may not be accurate enough to receive payment on. So please do not wait until November 15th. If anything received prior to November 15th, so up until 11:59 on November 14th, with issues will be sent back to you. But the key point here is to remember that if we send it back to you on November 14th when you submit it, or we send it back on November 15th, you only have until November 18th to make the corrections we're asking for. If you do not return the corrected or needed information, you may not get that reimbursement. So it is just essential that you're aware of these timelines. Something that we have changed and we have committed to is that our current timeline until October 31st is I think 3 business days for processing. It is now, as of November 1, going to be 48 hours for processing. So in November, we have 2 weekends, the 14th and 15th being a Saturday and Sunday. So we'll be meeting actually tomorrow to design coverage for November 7th, 8th, and 11th. We're looking at 2 different options, and so the team's going to meet and decide which one they want to go with. But we are committing to making sure that there is staff reviewing emails, reviewing attestations on those days so that we meet the 48-hour timeline. Effective November 12th, all attestations and required attachments are going to be submitted to a central email. So once we have that centralized email set up, we will email it out. And if you do not have your attestations submitted prior to November 12th, that's going to go to whomever in the state is next in line, okay? We want to make sure that you get that feedback within that 48 hours sooner if possible, and the best way to achieve that is centralization of the process. So you may not hear from your local provider relations after November 12th if you submitted on that day or later. You're going to hear from whomever provider relations across the state is next in line to review an attestation. Okay, so hopefully everybody will have their submissions in before November 12th, and you won't have to deal with someone you've never talked to before, but we will. November 12th is a Thursday, and so we picked that date because of the 48-hour timeline. That way anything coming in that day or Friday the 13th would go to a centralized distribution to be managed effectively before the end date of submission, November 15th. We will have a centralized schedule on the 14th and 15th, rotating shifts to check that distribution email and to process those attestations that come in. So you will not be waiting. The only way that you might not hear about your attestation until Monday the 16th is if you turned it in on the 15th. So otherwise we're committed to really zeroing in. And again, we hope that doesn't happen and we get, slam blasted the last weekend, but it is possible. And we have over 30 people that are going to be scheduled over that weekend to make sure it happens and gets processed. So we'll let you know more about the centralized email when we have it set up, and we'll send that out through distribution list and through local offices. So the data that we wanted to share with you, every week I'm putting together a current data status for administration of DD. And so this is where we are at today. We started this last week, and so that's how I can show you where the increases were. We have 288 providers who are eligible for ISL Group Home CARES Act. 71 of those have submitted a submission, which is 13 more than last week. 35 of those have requested 100% of what they're allowed for the residential allocation, and 12 of those have been submitted since last week. Of course, in the residential or the ISL group home, you can submit multiple attestations until or even after you meet your max, because we will track anything above the allocation amount that you submit. So there are more attestations than there are providers, because some providers submit 2, 3, 4 different attestations, and that is an uptick of 22 since last week. So you can see that all of our attestations that we've received have been submitted to stage 2, and there's been 28 submitted since last week. And then here you can see how much has been approved. So here, no, wait a minute, there's something wrong. Is that right? No, that's right. It just looks like such a big number that it just really throws me off when you see it. But this is the amount that has been approved at the local level for ISL Group Home, and this is the amount so far at stage 2 that has been approved. The numbers are not the same because, remember, this was pulled at 9 a.m. this morning. So point in time, even though we've submitted these 86 to that next stage, there were some submitted after Stacy at Central Office had already locked off for the day. So that's where the difference is. And I know Angie emailed and said that Stacy had brought her several already today and that she assigned those. And I see there's a question there, and I will promise that I will get to that. So day have in support employment, there's 148. So between these two numbers, there's a total unduplicated number of providers eligible for 345. Okay, so it's the same thing. You can see the number of submitted attestations. DAHAB, supportive employment, is an attestation of lost revenue. Therefore, it's always going to be the same number here. And we have sent all but one to the second stage at this point. So in the last week, especially since the announcement on the 20th, I am happy to say that everything that we've received has been, except for two, have been processed within 2 business days. So, I think we've really upped our game. We've done some additional training, made some changes to make things more effective. And so I think that's why we're seeing the quicker turnaround. And, of course, we're doing more training with providers. So, and you can see here's our total right now, and that's almost a $2 million increase from last week. So just a few providers, you can see the increases aren't huge, but it only takes a few providers with large allocation to make a really big impact on how much money has been expended. So, Alicia, in the chat box, you asked if we have submitted an invoice for expenses already and plan to do another submission. Do we need to do another attestation? And the answer is yes. The attestation is dated and notarized, and it is specific to the invoice that you attach to that attestation when you submitted it, okay? So if you submit another attestation later, then it doesn't match the date on your attestation. So please, yes, that's a great question. Thank you for asking for clarification. All right, so a brief little overview. I'm sure you guys are just bombarded and overwhelmed with everything COVID, and nothing is any different about the grant funding, right? I mean, there's so many different types of funding. It can be overwhelming and confusing to remember which kind you're applying for with DD and how it's different. So just wanted to give a little bit of an overview. For the DAHAB and supportive employment, this is an attestation of lost revenue. Okay, this is about lack of business. It's not about how many expenses you had. It's a very distinct difference between DAHAB and supportive employment. Just lost revenue, and you're just attesting to how much revenue you lost during that period and signing. No invoices or evidence is necessary to that. So the DAHAB is a super simple, quick turnaround. The amount of revenue that you lost is determined by you, okay? And remember that you've had to have lost it due to COVID-19, not to some other reason. We got the question yesterday asking for clarification. Does their amount of revenue have to equal the amount of the division allocation? And the answer is no. The amount that you lost could be vastly more or vastly less than the grant allocation that you will receive. Okay, whatever you submit, whether it's less or more, we'll document what you submitted, but the amount that you receive is the number that you were provided by provider relations. Okay? So ISL group home is different because it is an attestation about expenses, which must be attributable to COVID. So DAHAB, supportive employment, is loss of revenue. ISL group home is about expenses. What cost did you have because of COVID? And we're going to talk about some of those examples of allowable and not allowable expenses here in just a second. So, the items, we want to make a distinction. This came up last week. We understand a lot of providers may be holding on to attestations because they have not actually paid for their order yet. So we want to be clear that the items do not have to be received or paid to count as an expense. You can attach evidence that you've made the order. You can attach an invoice. You can attach a purchase order. So we recognize that especially right now, shipping and delivery could take a long time, especially if you've ordered something that's in short, is in high demand. And therefore, you're waiting on production to occur, right? So we are not going to hold you up because you've not actually paid it out or because you don't have it in your hands. So we will accept those purchase orders, those evidences, that you've actually made an order and not expect to see that. Now, we understand some of you might be waiting because you're uncomfortable submitting an attestation because you haven't paid it out yet. And we understand, and that is your choice. What I'd recommend to you is have everything else ready, have everything else lined out and filled in on your invoice and ready to go, because if that's what you're waiting on, which is your choice, and November 13th comes around and you still are waiting, you can go ahead and submit. And don't forget, you can submit as many invoices as you'd like. So send in everything else and send that in at the last minute if you have to. But just know that that's your choice, and we will accept those purchase orders, okay? And just wanted to repeat, because some people, we've gotten this question, but the evidence is, receipts or invoices are official receipts and invoices and not a provider-generated receipt. We have gotten a request, I lost my receipt, can I handwrite something out? And that answer is no. In today's world with technology and everything available, you should be able to produce the trackable evidence that something actually occurred, okay? So tips for success and completing your attestations. A key point that some people don't understand is your grant payments are connected to SAM-2. So providers are registered with SAM-2, especially because they receive POS or general revenue funding or DD room and board payments. So day hubs and supportive employment providers may never have registered with SAM-2 because they maybe have never had POS authorizations. You have to be registered in SAM-2, and your information has to match what you put on your attestation. So something you can do if you're waiting to submit an attestation and you're still gathering your information, go into Missouri Buys. That's what feeds SAM-2. Go ahead and log into Missouri Buys and check to make sure your remittance address is accurate and the same. If it is not, you need to go ahead and process a request to get it up to date, because it takes up to 2 weeks. Updates to SAM-2 are done by Office of Administration Accounting, and it's not something central office or the local office can do for you. So we've had several of these come back. Either the provider's not registered with MoBuys and SAM-2, or the address that is in SAM-2 is not what they put on their attestation, and they have to match. So that's, that's a preliminary preparation step you can take, because that by itself is not anything anybody else can correct, and it will hold you up. So we are going ahead and correcting and submitting the attestations, but we're having to hold them, or Stacy is holding them, until we receive your confirmation that you corrected the address, and then she has to hold it until she can verify that SAM-2 has been updated. So that could take a while, so please do that. Make sure that the required fields on your attestation are filled out. It's the ones that are online, it's very easy because it's not a fill form, so it's very easy to miss that there's part of a line that requires you to put something in it, right? It requires your provider name. I think you must have to put it in there 7 times or something like that. So make sure you're looking that you have every required field filled out. And we're going to look at something here in a minute that I think can help you do that. You need to make sure that you're indicating the agency's contracted name and correct identifiers. So we've had agencies using their common name on the attestations, or the FEIN or the MPI are not what matches in our system. Maybe you have a state plan contract and you put the wrong MPI on your attestation. So that's a pretty common occurrence. So make sure that those things match. We have a fill form available for you that for the attestation that PR emailed in September, and that fill form will make sure that you don't miss your spots. So I'm going to log out of this little screen here, and I'm going to share that fill form for you. It is not yet posted to the website, but it will be. So it is the same thing, but you can see that you can, if it would work for me, but you can see that you can, it's highlighted and bolded in the body. This is a common thing, a common issue here. This is the most frequently missed place on the attestation for provider name. So we will get this out there on the website so that you guys have it. It was emailed last month, but I know how that goes when your email is crazy busy right now and you have somebody different perhaps filling out the attestations for you. So we'll get this online, but we have it in both the Day Have Employment and the ISO Group Home in fill form. So this, in the fill form, it will just help you tremendously make sure that you don't miss anything on the form. That's easily remedied. Now, something that we weren't doing early on, we were not correcting forms for providers. If you missed a field, we were sending it back and we were having you fill that in. So what we are going to do as of immediately, if it's something we can change for you, we will change it for you. So if you've missed this spot of your provider name, then we will add the provider name for you so that we don't have to spend the time ping-ponging through emails to get that fixed and new scans and all of that good jazz. So the fill form makes it so that you don't have to worry about that, but if you do still use the old attestation, we will work with you to get those corrected as quickly as we can. I'll go back to my presentation. So attach only allowable expenses. Now, you can choose to do what you want to do. We've seen a lot of providers, they say, but these are all my expenses and I want to attach them all. But what I can tell you is that if you attach expenses that are not allowed, it causes a longer level of review because we have to figure out why it's attached. We have to ask, what it's for, determine if it's valid or not, and then we have to figure out whether you included it in the expenses that you calculated. And if you're ever audited, putting expenses on your attestations or your invoices that are not allowed could really bring a higher level of scrutiny. So try to only list the allowable expenses, and that's those things right there. Those are going to help you as much as you can. So allowable expenses, we wanted to share with you everything that we've seen to date. Obviously, any purchase of PPE or order, I should have put purchase or order of PPE, medical supplies, or equipment necessary to support our people, sanitation products or cleaning services, telehealth equipment and access fees. If you purchased tablets, if you purchased Bluetooth medical technology to interface with StationMD so that you could get a better service from them, those things are allowable expenses. Additional temporary space for offsite quarantine, you can also invoice for that. Food for staff who worked at a service site is allowable if supplying the food for staff is not normally a part of your agency's practice. So remember, your expense is a COVID-related expense. If it's something that you always did, it's not an additional expense now due to COVID, okay? So if you did not previously offer or pay for food for staff while on shift, and you do now to keep, people from running out in the middle of a shift, to, minimize as much as you can that community level of involvement during shift, then it's allowable now. Any accommodations you might have made to meet open air policy monitoring, that's a wide variety of things. So I've seen a wide variety of things, and we're very, very flexible on that. If you can relate what accommodation you've made, even if that's a slight modification to the property to accommodate, because maybe you don't have any place people can sit and talk on your property outside of the home. So maybe you built something specifically for open air policy, or for them visiting with their family, right? During extreme times when it's difficult to have people in the home and you're facilitating family visits on the property and you had to make accommodations because you did not have any. That's acceptable. So we want to point that out because we've not seen a lot of that, just a little bit, but it's important to note. More allowable expenses, overtime, hero or hazard pay, temporary pay increases, any specialized training time that you had spent due to COVID, other employee costs related to the pandemic, paid leave due to COVID-19. Yes, you offer paid leave all the time to employees, but maybe during COVID you offered more, or maybe you had a policy that if they were positive in quarantine that you paid for that and it did not come out of their leave time. So that would be an allowable expense. I've seen one provider increase their employer percent of benefits. So as an incentive to try to maintain staff and decrease turnover, they increased to 100% coverage of their staff's medical expense or medical benefit. And of course, that would be just for the time period allowed in COVID. But I've seen some really creative and great things providers are doing for their staff, and just make sure that you give yourself credit for doing those things and being creative. So ISLs have an avenue to be reimbursed for additional staff hours due to work closures, due to day hab closures. Group homes don't have that same ability. So if you had additional staff hours that were not reimbursed by the division due to COVID program closures or some other, things, quarantine, then that is an allowable expense here, okay? A special note, we just wanted to, we do not look for or expect reams of payroll documentation to show us evidence of these expenses. You can actually just itemize on the itemization or the invoice form, the time period that you're talking about you paid out. I've seen a couple of different ways. The things that come to mind are the time period that you're talking about that you paid out, say overtime, the number of staff that were impacted, the number of hours, and your total amount. In the end, you're responsible to maintain auditable evidence, and we know that you have payroll evidence, okay? So it's those other intangibles. Maybe you did a bonus, right? Maybe you did a bonus for employees who have worked for the last 3 months and not, taken time off. That's an allowable expense. So all of these expenses on this slide are trackable in some way, shape, or form back into payroll, so we know that it's there. So we're not asking you to reproduce that in an attachment. We know that's a lot of work for you guys, and none of you have time for that, okay? So you can just itemize that if you'd like. So some examples of disallowed expenses, COVID-19 testing. So if you're doing any COVID-19 testing, Sentinel or otherwise with your staff, that is reimbursed directly by the department. You can invoice us any testing expenses that you have, okay? So that's why it's a disallowed expense, because there's obviously another avenue that we have committed to funding that. ISL group home is not about loss of revenue. Remember, you can only do expenses. Base hourly wages, not overtime, but just your base. If you always pay $10 an hour, you're still paying $10 an hour plus overtime during COVID. So your base hourly wages are not an allowable expense. Food for individuals served. We get a lot of questions about that. Remember, it has to be an expense due to COVID. So if it was an expense before COVID, it's not an expense that you can count towards the grant today. I know some of you might have stockpiled food when there appeared to be a shortage and everybody was grabbing everything off of the shelf. And if you did that, there are other ways that you might be able, that you can mitigate getting reimbursement for that, but not through the grant, okay? Obviously, well, I say obviously, maybe not so, but no, you cannot use the COVID to purchase real estate. As noted on the previous, what is allowed is to temporarily acquire, which would mean leasing or renting space. But no, you cannot use or invoice us if you purchase real estate during COVID. Another ancillary invoice that we received a question on was exercise equipment. They were going to create a gym in the provider office space or wherever that individuals could go to exercise during COVID. And that is also not an allowable expense because exercising can be in a variety of different ways, and it's not prohibited from, going outside and walking or doing other things. And remember, it is for the expenses for the emergency are to furnish immediate aid and relief. Okay, so exercise equipment doesn't really fit into either one of those things. Necessary expenditures are incurred due to public health emergency, providing immediate aid and relief. Okay, so we don't have a large list of disallowed expenses. You guys have done a really, really good job of submitting things that were clearly allowable. Okay, so my list isn't long. I think it's actually one slide, and I've kept it pretty short there. I want to just get you guys the essentials, the overview and understanding of the actual stages in the process, and just a recap of the other data and the purpose and allowable expenses and the tips to help you get through the process as quickly and efficiently as possible. So do you all have any questions that you haven't asked? It's been kind of radio silent, so we'll give it a few moments, and if no one has questions, you'll get some time back in your day. Okay. Mention how they will receive the funds. So it is, and that's a good question. So, and I'm not sure that I actually understand the answer. I know it bills through SAM too. But I've not specifically asked the question of whether that's a direct deposit or a check. I need to ask that question, follow up, and then we'll post that with the Friday calls, questions, and answers. Okay? Was that what you were asking, was through what method? Okay, looking for a check when the money was there. Thank you.
Wanda, we had someone respond directly to me saying that they received theirs via direct deposit.
Thank you. Thank you. And that's what I assumed it would do, but you know what happens when you assume things. So I did not want to answer that that's what my assumption was. All right. So as Heike said, we will be recording this. We will make it available. We will get the fill forms online for you all. And if you have any questions about what's been presented today, please feel free to reach out to your local PR. If they are not available, feel free to reach out to me, wanda.crocker@dmh.mo.gov. And I think everybody pretty knows the whole kind of gist with our email addresses are all the same, right? But please don't hesitate to ask questions, okay? We are all sitting here. Shouldn't say sitting here, but we are making it a priority to have bodies in seats a minimum of 2 hours every day checking emails, okay? So everybody, 2 hours every day, checking, looking for submissions. So do not hesitate to reach out and ask. Okay?
One thing I also want to toss out there, Wanda, before you hop off is I know that we've already had some folks ask when the recording will be available, when that presentation will be available. as soon as Cisco has the recording available for download, we'll package up everything that we have, and we will send an email blast out. Our goal is to get that out tomorrow. So be watching for that. We know that this is very timely, and there are folks that weren't able to be on the call and that you want to share that with. So please watch for that, and we will get that out ASAP.
Thank you, Heike. All right, everyone, you just got 15 minutes of your day back. Thank you for joining us, and I hope it was helpful.